We've now got both a square screen component and multiple color counters that we're showing inside of it. So this starts to raise a really interesting question. We need to have three different state variables, one for tracking the amount of red, one for the amount of blue, and one for the amount of green that we're trying to show to the user. So now we need to figure out exactly where we're going to locate those different state variables. In other words, where are we going to create them? Are we going to create a state variable inside of square screen, or are we going to create three separate ones in each of these different components? In this video, we're going to take a look at a couple diagrams that's going to give us guidance on how we tackle exactly this problem. Okay, so first off, here's a diagram of our current component hierarchy. We've got our square screen, that is the parent, and we've got three separate instances of color counter. One for showing red, one for green, and one for blue. And the first thing I want to point out here is that all these different components kind of have different demands on these state variables we want to create. In the case of the square screen, this thing wants to only read the three different state variables that we need to create. When I say three different state values, I'm talking about one state variable for tracking the amount of red, one for the amount of green, and one for the amount of blue. And remember, those different values are going to range from 0 up to 255. Square Screen needs to read these three different state values because it's going to eventually be responsible for showing that colored square and applying those three different colors to it as a background color property. On the other hand, these child components down here need to change those different values because each of them are going to show some buttons that are going to allow a user to tap it to either increase, say, or the amount of red or decrease the amount of red. Same thing for green and blue. So with that in mind, here's the general rule that we're going to use anytime we've got some kind of shared state that needs to be distributed among multiple different components. So generally, we're going to create state variables in the most parent component that needs to either read or change a state value. In this case, the square screen is the most parent component, and it needs to read those three different state values. So we're going to create those three different state values inside of square screen. Now notice I say on here generally. There are some situations, and situations that we're going to definitely run into together inside of this course, where this rule doesn't quite apply. But you're going to see those situations in great detail as we start to work on these other applications. So again, we're going to locate, or we're going to create, our three different state values inside of square screen because it is the most parent component that needs to either read or change those three state values. Now that starts to raise a really interesting question. If we create these three different state values inside of square screen, how are color counter, all three of these, how are they going to change those values? And for that matter, if our application was different, how would they read those values if they needed to as well? Well, two diagrams to answer those questions. So first off, if a child ever needs to read a state value that is created inside the parent, then we can pass that state value down as a prop. Now, just a quick aside here, in our application, color counter does not need to read these values whatsoever. Color counter has nothing to do with actually reading or printing out the current color values. I'm just showing you this for your own info just so you understand how we would approach this problem. So if we for some reason had to communicate the current value of red or green or blue from square screen down to color counters, we would pass it down as a prop using the prop system. So remember I showed you a diagram a little bit ago about state, and I said that we could technically pass a state value down to a child as a prop. And that's where the state system and the prop system start to kind of commingle, and that's when they get a little bit confusing. Once again, we're going to see an example of this later on inside the course. So don't worry, you'll get a lot of experience with this as well. Now, what about if a child component needs to change a state value? That's the situation we're in. We need our child components to change the value of red or green or blue that's currently being managed by Square Screen. If that's the case, then we're going to pass a callback function down to these children as a prop. So we're going to essentially pass down a callback function from Square Screen down to color counter. And inside that callback function, color counter can invoke that function and make a change to that state value. That will change the state value inside of Square Screen, causing it to re-render. And remember, whenever a parent re-renders or kind of re-shows itself on the screen, it will also re-render all of its children as well. All right, so in this video, I showed you a couple confusing diagrams. This is just our first taste of managing state between different parent-child components. So I'm sure at this point, some of this terminology is a little bit strange, but like I said, you're going to get a lot of practice doing exactly these different scenarios throughout different applications inside this course. And as a matter of fact, we're going to have to essentially do this exact case right here in the next video. So let's take a quick pause. And in the next video, we're going to make sure that the square screen passes a callback function down to each of these different components that will allow those components to update those state values. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute.